I'm going to jump right into it. And I want to, first of all, thank everyone for this invitation, this wonderful invitation. Can everyone see my PowerPoint? Okay. Well, then we're off to a good start. Es un honor estar aquí con ustedes en un momento de históricamente, profundamente muy importante. It is a real honor to be here with you at a moment of great ecological, historical importance. And I'm going to focus on the peace with the earth. But before I get started with that, I want to do a very brief land acknowledgement. I am all bundled up. As you can see, we had an overnight low of 39. We are in the San Luis Valley of south central Colorado, about an hour north of Taos, New Mexico, at an elevation of about 8,000 feet above sea level. And we've been having overnight lows in the high 30s. And it's very cold this morning, but it's a beautiful morning. I wish to give thanks and ask for the right to speak before the enduring First People of Colorado, whose lands and waters we co-inhabit. This is Nuche, which is to say Southern Ute, Diné, which is to say Navajo, Tiwa, Taos Pueblo people, and Genisarequis, lands and waters here in Colorado. A lot of people don't realize that the acequia villages of the Upper Rio Grande are about 1/3 Genisaro, Genisarequis. These are the descendants of the enslaved. And in our part of the world, this includes Diné people, it includes Nuche, it includes Tiwa peoples, as well as Arapaho and other peoples from the High Plains. So we are an indigenous community. Chicano land grant dating back to 1847, 48, before around the time of the U.S. war against Mexico. And so I just want to acknowledge the First Peoples who still co-inhabit this beautiful valley with us. But I want to start by questioning, what do we mean by earth and what do we mean by peace? These are important ideas and there's no real agreement, whether you're looking at environmental and other social justice movements, whether you're talking to scientists, whether you're talking to politicians and policymakers. We have really a clash of paradigms, and it's important to understand each of these models of the relationship between humans and the earth if we're to progress toward peace. And so for many years now, a good 40 years that I've been teaching in academia and higher education, I've been trying to teach these ideas to my students. And in fact, we have three different models of the human relationship to the earth: the natural resource model, the wilderness model, and what I call the homeland ethic. The natural resource model is still the dominant one and has been ever since Gifford Pinchot created the United States Forest Service. And it basically views the earth as a resource, as a commodity, as a thing with a price. And that's why for decades, for generations, our public lands here in the United States and occupied Turtle Island and across the world has been mainly viewed as a source for extractive industries. Timber, mining, grazing, all of these are extractive industries that view the earth as a resource. And so this is the dominant model. It is based on the idea that the earth exists for the benefit of human beings, to be exploited for profit. It's what the philosophers, environmental ethics people call an extrinsic value view of nature, of the environment, of the earth. By extrinsic value, it means that the value of the earth is for external forces, that is viewed as separate from the earth, separate from nature, which is to say, human political economy. That's what we mean by extrinsic value. The value of the earth outside of itself, outside of its own needs, outside of its own ecological realities. The second model of the human relation to the planet is what we call the wilderness ethic. And this, of course, is attributed first to the founder of the Sierra Club, John Muir, who proposed that wilderness had to be kept separate from human beings, that it had intrinsic value, that the earth is valuable unto itself. The ecological diversity of the planet, all the different life forms that co-inhabit the planet are value in and of themselves, independent of the value that these may hold for human beings. Pardon me, fighting an allergy. The problem with this approach is that it erases the indigenous inhabitants of the so-called wilderness. It wasn't wilderness to the people who had lived there for tens of thousands of years. It was their home, which brings us to the third paradigm. The environmental justice movement probably did more to advance this view of the human relationship to the environment than anything else that I can think of. After all, while mainstream environmentalists basically were concerned with conserving natural resources for future generations, and this was certainly true with the United Nations Environment Program as well, and while groups like the Sierra Club, the Wilderness Federation, and so on viewed wilderness as something to be kept separate from human beings, the idea of home, of the earth as our home, not only is an indigenous view, it's the oldest view. It's the oldest philosophy. And it's also the one that resonates most closely with modern ecosystem science, with conservation biology and all of that. And so I counterpose these three because we need to realize that when politicians and policymakers and lawyers and Supreme Courts are making decisions about the nature of so-called environmental protection, and they basically dismiss the so-called Chevron doctrine, we're facing a situation where the natural resource or commodity view of the earth is becoming hegemonic, and it is suppressing any other kinds of views. This happens at a time when, in fact, a lot of our public land agencies, all these being considered unceded indigenous territories, have been working hard over the last decade or so, and certainly under the current administration, on co-management of public lands with those of us who consider it our home rather than public land. And so you have a lot of co-management agreements between federal agencies like the U.S. Forest Service, the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, and others, National Park Service, that are collaborating with tribal and indigenous communities on managing these precious landscapes. But this is the hard part. A lot of environmentalists and even some environmental justice movements have not come to grips with the fact that the primary driver of environmental destruction, of the destruction of the earth, it's not just all humans. You hear that a lot in the narrative. The dominant narrative is humans are destroying the planet. Well, the fact of the matter is that 100 corporations can produce 71% of global emissions that are affecting climate change, climate chaos, as I prefer to call it. 100 corporations produce 71% of the pollution that's affecting our climate system. So the idea that all humans are responsible for environmental destruction is false. It is a specific kind of human organization of the economy, capitalism, and specifically neoliberal capitalism in our current context, which has been from the beginning wed to settler colonialism, which is a structure, not an event. And it's a structure that continues to be based on the erasure of indigenous people, the occlusion and dismissal of indigenous knowledge, especially ethnoecology, the indigenous knowledge of the earth, of ecosystems. All of this is suppressed and erased under the capitalist neoliberal regimes that dominate the planet. And yet environmentalists haven't really come to understand, well, what do we mean by capitalism, Peña? And I'm always asked, and if you're critiquing capitalism, does that make you a communist or a socialist? I don't consider myself either of those two terms. I do consider myself a commonist, like in the commons, or communalist, if you want to use that term. I'm a communist, not a communist. And I believe that we need to treat not just the earth, but each other with a common sense of respect of how our community wealth and well-being is based on this very ancient indigenous wisdom that is encapsulated in the lowland Maya concept of Inlakech. Inlakech, tú eres mi otro yo, you are my other self. And this is a very different way of thinking of yourself as a human being that appeals to the idea that you can only be a human being in relation to others. And in fact, if you look at Nahuatl as a language and all of the indigenous languages of what is now North and South America, there's not a single indigenous language that includes the word individual. To be human is to be in relation to others. And this is what I mean by being a commonist. And so we need to be able to confront this very fundamental idea that the primary driver of environmental change, including climate systems collapse, this climate chaos that we're facing, is the political economy of capitalism, which is essentially a system based on the idea that everything is a commodity. The genetic material in your body, your DNA, all the way to the biosphere. So from the molecular level to the biosphere, everything is a thing with a price. For the right price, you can get it. And you can destroy whatever stands in the way as you grasp for that thing with a price. So it is the commoditization of life, the commoditization of everything on the planet, that is what I'm referring to as capitalism. And so regardless of how we organize political systems around this idea, that fact stands very clearly established, not just by social scientists, but even by physical scientists, biological scientists, and others. So, which brings me to a very important idea if we are to make peace with the earth. We need to recognize that when you look at maps of biodiversity across different regions of the earth, it's always associated with linguistic or cultural diversity, which is to say, the most biodiverse places on the planet are those that are also the most culturally diverse, which is to say, there are the territories and regions that have been stewarded actively for thousands of years by indigenous populations. And this is why in the environmental justice movements globally, as well as within the United States, the search for peace is always about ending this connection between ecocide, the destruction of ecology of the earth, and ethnocide, the destruction of indigenous peoples. Ethnocide and ecocide go hand in hand, and in order to make peace with the planet, we need to recognize these basic underpinnings of the problem. Next, I want to turn to the idea, well, what do we mean by peace? Is peace the absence of conflict? I will argue that history so far shows us that there can be no peace without conflict. But the question is the conflict going to be violent or is it going to be life-affirming? That's a big question for us that we need to learn to resolve. And I think we have a lot to talk about in terms of that as well, with respect to how this connects back to indigenous populations, indigenous communities. I would appeal to you to gain familiarity with UNDRIP, with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But basically what it is saying is that if we were to arrive at peace among all of us, all nations, all peoples, we first have to have peace with the First Nations, with the original peoples. And this is, of course, based on respect for indigenous communities and their territorial and cultural autonomy. Can we do this? Well, we can work towards peace if we begin with these 6 problem areas or challenges that allow us to reclaim our future in order to change the present circumstances that are affecting our ability to make peace with the earth. Land back. Settler colonialism has dispossessed indigenous peoples of 98% of their homeland territories across the planet, and that includes within the context of the United States. So the return of indigenous territories is a very central premise of working towards peace with the earth, not only because it is socially just, but because it makes ecological sense, that it makes sense to give land back to the original stewards who, after all, managed the earth without destroying it for literally thousands and thousands of years. However, in order to do land back, you have to couple this with a number of other movement objectives or mission goals, demilitarizing our landscapes, demilitarizing our economies. I remember many years ago, ecofeminists were having a really important discussion about how much it costs to build an F-16. And it was something like 32 million back in the 1980s and 90s. 32 million for one killing flying machine. With that 32 million, you could build several tens of thousands of homes. You could refit several hundred schools so that they're no longer exposing the students to asbestos or lead paint. In other words, in an economy oriented towards care of the other, and that's exactly what demilitarization means, we would shift our focus from spending 32 million per F-16 instead of these other priorities that are left unmet. The other thing that connects to land back and demilitarization is ecological restoration. Capitalism has created a lot of devastation of our ecosystems alongside the destruction of cultural diversity. Evidence of that, for example, is we're facing what's now called the sixth extinction. And there are many different species across all the phyla that are being exterminated alongside indigenous peoples. Other evidence, for example, is that in 1492, there were approximately 10,000 unique indigenous linguistic families, and we're down now to about 3,000. So biological diversity and cultural diversity are casualties of 500 years of settler colonialism wed to capitalism. Ecological restoration, therefore, seems to be a very much an integral part of land back and of demilitarization. And that instead of investing in the United States accounts for 40% of military spending globally, that's astonishing. We should invest in ecological restoration, which creates conditions for peace with the planet, and I would argue also peace among different peoples. When people are working together to heal their watersheds, they're no longer fighting over who gets the water. When people are working to restore their forests or their scrublands or their prairies, they're no longer fighting over the grass or over the trees because they're focused on restoring the ecosystem rather than the extrinsic value approach of exploiting it as a commodity. Ecological restoration, therefore, to me seems like a very important part of working toward peace with the earth, healing the earth, caring for the earth as your relation, which has been practiced by indigenous cultures and civilizations for thousands of years, is something that we need to strengthen and focus on as we work toward peace with the earth. All of this, of course, I think will result in integration of these movements for peace with the earth with the struggle for climate justice. It is clear that indigenous communities and BIPOC communities, both in rural and in urban settings, both in the US and across the globe, are already being killed off by climate chaos. And so we are the most vulnerable and the least protected. As the environmental justice movement says, we don't have the complexion for protection. And it's not a matter of predicting some future chaos. The chaos is already with us, with extreme weather events, flooding, stronger storms, all kinds of chaos. Here in our own area, our snowpack is now completely unpredictable. One year we have a lot, the next year we're in a drought. The moisture content of the snow is being reduced. And so that affects our prospects for farming. All of this also implies, I think, I want to hurry up because I don't want to run out of time, is we need to end patriarchy. All these systems, capitalism, neoliberal ideology, the military-industrial complex, extractive colonialism are and have been created mostly by men. And men who cling on to an ideology that would want to see women reduced, as J.D. Vance would have it, to the role of basically reproductive machines. And so ending patriarchy is also about ending hatred, hatred of those who are different in their sexuality, in their approach to being in love with their significant others. All of these are also part of the patriarchal dimension. As ecofeminists have taught us for decades, ever since the work of people like Carolyn Merchant or Vandana Shiva, we have learned that patriarchy means a system that treats women as it treats nature. Nature is to be developed, it's to be controlled for the pleasure and profit of men, and so too women. And so the exploitation of nature and of women go hand in hand. They cannot be separated under this capitalist regime. So in the end, what I would urge you we need to focus on is how do we decommodify all our relations? And by all our relations, I mean the relationships that we have with our neighbors, with our families, with our communities, but also with the environment, with the earth. We need to decommodify our relations in general. And how do we do this? And this is the final part of my talk today. I think we need to challenge globalization. And in fact, this is already happening. But that also means ending neoliberalism. And there's a lot of debate about what that means. And I'm going to clarify what I think it means most in the most important, succinct manner, since there's been thousands of definitions and conceptualizations of what neoliberalism is. First of all, we need to understand that neoliberal ideology is a kind of hyper-individualism. It's good to be greedy, and that individual freedom to be greedy, to accumulate as many elements of utilities and wealth will optimize the social good. And therefore, this perpetuates, I think, not only antagonism and indifference to others as human beings and to others as the earth, but it also perpetuates a kind of diffused factory of violence. And some of my colleagues here in the audience, like Beatriz Vera, have been following this idea ever since I published my book on the maquila industry in 1997, when I talked about the terror of the machine, the diffused factory of violence. And we're seeing this reach a whole new level that I think is in part the result not only of globalization, but of the impunity with which actors in that globalization set of networks, they operate with incredible impunity. And the most recent example of that we just heard in the last few days is the Zionist attack on Syria, on Lebanon, surrounding neighbors, supposedly in an effort to deal with Hezbollah, so-called terrorist organizations that are actually, in my view, fighting a righteous resistance against Zionist violence. And so terror by pagers, I would call it, is a dimension of this diffuse factory of violence. It's very hard to pinpoint who's responsible. There's very little accountability, and it's become a menace not just to those who are identified as enemies of the state of Israel, but anyone on the planet could be subject to this sort of murder and assassination. So globalization also perpetuates what I call slow death. And by slow death, I'm referring primarily to the destruction of our local food systems, of our local agro ecosystems, of our traditional indigenous culinary arts and practices. Slow death via fast food, slow death via processed food. This is part of the focus of the work that we're doing here in San Luis. And so in order to build these movements, we need to recognize that, above all, neoliberalism is not just deregulation of the industries. It's not just privatizing the state sector like Mexico did beginning under Salinas de Gortari way back in the before NAFTA in the early 1990s. It is also about destroying all of our institutions of collective action, unions, worker associations, mutual aid societies, self-help networks, all kinds of institutions of collective action. That is the primary goal of neoliberalism, is to destroy institutions of collective action. So what do? This is my final slide. I think we can't wait. We don't wait for a revolution. We are already in the midst of a growing revolution that is about relocalization, is one of the first principles of this hidden, invisible networks of everyday life type of revolution. And what do I mean by relocalization? We are rebuilding place-based solidarity economies now. You don't have to wait for this to happen. It's unfolding in El Paso and Juarez. It's unfolding here. All across the globe, we're seeing movements for food sovereignty. And food sovereignty is one of the most important ways that we can organize this relocalization. So this means sustaining the resurgence, the return of mutual aid traditions and institutions of collective action, which I would call, it's about mobilization around the theme of relocalizing our food systems, our housing systems, all of our socially and culturally significant systems. This means, I think, emphasizing the care economy in order to attain community health equity. And this is probably one of the most difficult things involved in building toward a peace with the earth. We have a lot of trauma and a lot of intergenerational historical trauma, which are always the result of settler colonialist acts of dispossession, erasure, and displacement. Healing intergenerational historical trauma is part of our work here in the San Luis area. And one of the ways we do that is to connect the youth, the next generation, back to the land, as I'll show you in a closing video clip that I'm gonna show you in a minute. The hardest part for me is this last point. How do we go about unifying the material and spiritual dimensions of our existence? We have such binary constructs. We live still, despite all kinds of evidence to the contrary, we still live in a Cartesian world, a subject-object dichotomy, male, female, black, white, rich and poor, heterosexual and trans. All of these are binaries that have been created to control us and to feed the fear and hatred, to feed the fear that feeds the hatred that so many people opposed to peace with the earth seem to be absorbed by. So unifying these material and spiritual dimensions of our existence means re-indigenization of our cultures, becoming place-based again. This is very important if we're to work towards peace with the earth. And I'm going to show you next a very short video clip that I think captures, since some of you want to know what we're doing here in Colorado. I'm going to show you a beautiful clip hosted by Jasmine Salcido, one of our local youth interns in our Next Generation Farmers. And we are working with funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture through the Anschutz Medical School in Denver on a project that's called Indigenizing SNAP Nutrition Education. SNAP being food stamps, basically. And we're trying to change the SNAP program nationally by focusing on re-indigenizing the menu, in effect. And so I want to show you this, but before I start with this clip, let me point out that in our program, we've been doing it for 5 years. We've worked with about 100 or more of these next generation acequia farmers. They grow the crops. They learn how to care for the soil. They learn indigenous soil science. And they care for the soil. They grow the crops. They harvest the crops. And then with our indigenous chefs, they go back into the kitchen and prepare the crops that they grew and share them with the community to teach people about indigenous culinary arts, about our heritage cuisine, the importance of that to our health and well-being. And so it's a remarkable experience. I'm going to close by letting you all take a look at this beautiful little video clip. Oh, what happened? Why is it not working? Hold on.
Made a very big course dish with multiple varieties.
Let's start.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Salcido. We're here at the cooking class with Denise, and we've made a very big course dish with multiple varieties of ingredients. We went into the history of food. Like for corn instance, it's been around for many, many years. And our ancestors actually knew how to cook our corn to help us benefit in vitamins and nutrients that we need.
The special thing about corn like this, you have to put it through a process called nixtamalization. So like if you were to just grow corn and eat it right out of the field, you're not gonna get the nutrition that you get through this process. Like this is something that our ancestors figured out somehow. They learned how to cook corn with actually minerals like stone, sal, or lime salt. They would make this mixture and it changes the pH of the water and it helps the corn unlock all of this nutrition.
Today our first main course or our first course was the crema calabaza. It was a soup. And then our second course was our salad made with multiple greens, radishes, corn, avocado, and an avocado dressing. Our main course was huaraches, a shoe-shaped torta kind of thing. First, we prepared the corn, and then we put it through the grinder, and then we just smashed it down into a shoe shape, and then we toasted them and let them sit overnight. And we placed black beans, roasted vegetables, and garnishes. And then our dessert of the day was chocolate tamales.
Wait, you're making chocolate tamales? Yeah. You've never had chocolate tamales? No. Exactly.
Or sweet.
Exactly. So yeah, we're doing a chocolate one because cacao and chocolate, these are flavors from Mexico.
Big intake with that is how you cook your food to get the main nutrients that you need. There's certain ways to cook food to get the nutrients out and help you with your nutrition. I also learned how some herbs from Mexico can help you flush out parasites for your system. That teamwork is key, and if you put your mind to it, you can do anything and make anything.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning us in.